1800s, as the people of France suffered, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lived in paradise, becoming fat off of high taxes and benefiting from the suffering of the French people. They were rich and healthy, while the people of France starved and died under the harsh rule of King Louis and his aristocracy. By the late 1780s, the French peasants began hearing about the American Declaration of Independence, learning that British colonies had won their independence and founded a government by the people, for the people. With these ideas in mind, the people of France began a revolution, hoping to establish greater political equality. As this revolution caught wind, King Louis began cooperating with foreign powers to escape and shut down this revolution. Louis disguised his family and tried to escape, but was captured and thrown into prison. In 1793, Louis was condemned and executed for conspiracy with foreign powers to bring about the downfall of the French Revolution. Many people believe that King Louis was a traitor for trying to stop the French Revolution. However, statues of Louis still stand in France today. These statues were put up to remember King Louis's life and accomplishments, not to celebrate what he did wrong or to offend anyone. These statues are simply there to remember him for his role in French history. In contrast, more than 25 cities have removed Confederate monuments around the United States because of differing political agendas. Last year, on August 12th, clashes between white nationalists and violent protesters broke out in Charlottesville, Virginia because of plans to permanently remove Robert E. Lee's statue, resulting in the death of one person. Supporters of the permanent removal
like you said, I mean, it's about history. It is about history, but it don't mean it's got to be right there.
Supporters of the permanent removal of the statue believe that Robert E. Lee, General of the Confederate Army, was a representation of both racism and violence. On the other hand, advocates for the statue to remain believe that the statue should be kept untouched because of its historical value.
Racism.
The statues of Confederate generals and leaders should remain standing on public land because they honor a significant figure who fought for what they believed in and are an important reminder of something we should never forget. These statues represent historical contributions and support our rights as Americans. Therefore, they should remain on public land. In America today, people are becoming infuriated over statues of Confederate leaders because they believe that they represented something evil and that the individuals in the statues were fundamentally flawed. However, if all statues representing someone flawed were taken down, then no one statue would be left standing. As it says in Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." No one is perfect. These statues should remain on public land because they stand to honor a person for his or her contributions despite his or her flaws. Good evening. My name is Benjamin Crowe, and it is my honor to be discussing with you the debate regarding Confederate statues. I would now like to introduce my panelist, Justin Voss, a graduate student from FSU with a master's degree in history. Discussions over public statues memorializing a controversial person or event are not new. For example, during World War II, rows and rows of Jews walked through concentration camps to their death. Today, rows and rows of tourists walk through these hallowed grounds to remember what happened there. Concentration camps like Auschwitz were used by the Nazis to enslave and exterminate an entire race, but they can also be used to cause people who walk on their grounds to contemplate the error of what happened there. In the words of Auschwitz Museum Director Piotr Sinwinski, Auschwitz is a place of memory, but it's not just about history, it's also about the future. Germany keeps these symbols and monuments to remember what happened there so that these tragedies will never be repeated. It should be the same for the Confederate statues in America. These Confederate statues should remain on public land because they're a symbol of something that we should never forget. Confederate statues represent one of the few wars fought on United States soil, the Civil War, fought between the Union and Confederacy during the years 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was fought over trades, tariffs, and state rights, along with slavery. At the beginning of the Civil War, the northern states fought for federal government power over state governments and supported legislation against slavery. Southern states wanted more autonomy, which would, among other things, mean that they could declare that they accepted slavery whenever they wanted. As the Civil War progressed, the primary focus of the Union shifted and was refocused to end slavery and unify the country. Before the war began, Abraham Lincoln, a known abolitionist, won the presidency in November of 1860 and pledged to keep slavery out of new territories. Confederate states then seceded and bombarded Union forces at Fort Sumter, beginning the war. Raging for 4 bloody years of conflict, costing over 620,000 lives, the Civil War divided the nation, states, towns, and families, until the South finally surrendered in April of 1865. The end of slavery came from the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, which made all forms of slavery illegal in the United States. This war remains a major part of American history, and because of this, many towns in the North and South have statues standing to honor those who fought. The Civil War was a tragic loss of life, and it is important to honor those who fought and died to preserve the memory of what happened during that time. In General Robert E. Lee's own words, "A land without memories is a people without liberty." Adding to this, the permanent removal of Confederate statues would erase history and cause the American people to forget what happened during that time. Statues of Confederate generals and leaders should be left standing on public land because it preserved an important time in our history that should not be forgotten. Many people argue that statues of Confederate generals or leaders are symbols of white supremacy and therefore should be permanently removed. During an interview with my panelist, Mr. Voss, he stated that many of the Confederate statues that were designed and constructed from the late 1800s to early 1900s, during the beginning of segregation periods, which is why many people believe them to be symbols of white supremacy. They maintain the belief that the statues represented in the statues are offensive because they fought for the preservation of the Confederacy, which, they argue, represented slavery and a rebellion to the United States. These people call for the permanent removal of these statues based upon the ideals that they are racist, a symbol of white supremacy, and offensive. However, the primary purpose for these statues was to serve as a memorial to those who fought. These statues are not inherently a symbol of white supremacy. The South decided to erect statues during the late 1800s because they wanted to remember what happened during the Civil War. Historians agree that the Confederacy fought first and foremost for state rights, one of which was a right to decide as a state whether or not to have slavery. Statues of Confederate leaders and generals should remain standing on public land because they honor people for their contributions regardless of their flaws or mistakes. However, it is important to see the difference between idolizing and honoring a historical person. Some argue that statues of anyone who is involved with a racist cause, such as the Confederacy, are inappropriate, no matter what else that person might have done with his or her life. But if we were to take down statues because the people represented in the statue are less than perfect or even inherently flawed, then a monument should not stand in anyone's name because as humans, we are all flawed. In Ecclesiastes 7:20 it states, "Surely there is not a righteous man on earth that does good and never sins." From this verse in Ecclesiastes, clearly we see that no one is perfect and that we and the men and women viewed in the Confederate statues are far from it. Even though many people view Confederate statues as symbols of racism, these monuments represent both the good and bad in a person, reflecting that Jesus calls us to show the same love and compassion to one another in the same manner that he has shown to us. The monuments that we build of people are not because the figures in the statues are perfect, but rather to honor who the people were and what they contributed to history despite their flaws. For example, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a great leader of the civil rights movement who gave his life to promote change for African Americans. However, Dr. King was not without sin. Found by a committee of scholars from Boston University, Dr. King plagiarized passages in his dissertation for a doctoral degree in the university in 1955. Despite this flaw, Dr. King has an entire day dedicated to him, in addition to numerous statues across the United States to honor him and his accomplishments. It is important to recognize that even though Dr. King was dishonest in that instance, we still honor him for his contributions to society, regardless of his past mistakes. Even though Confederate leaders can be faulted for having fought for a cause that supported slavery, we should still honor them regardless because they are an essential part of our American history. According to the life and legend of Robert E. Lee, he, being Lee, did not attribute to blacks a permanent inferiority, as many did in the South, but allowed that time and God might change their condition in ways he could not foresee or predict. It was, or as should be, as he was fond of saying, all in God's hands. By the standards of many Confederates, his opinions were moderate, and the efforts on the parts of Northern congressmen to draw him out further on the subject failed. The people who wanted to take down the statue of Robert E. Lee believed that he, along with the statue, represented something evil, rather than recognizing the good qualities that he offered in service to his home in spite of his shortcomings. We should recognize that this statue was not erected as an idol or to represent something evil, but to be a symbol of what Lee accomplished during his lifetime. Lastly, statues of Confederate generals or leaders should remain on public land because our freedom of speech protects the rights to erect statues and appreciate them. This right is found in the First Amendment, where our founding fathers declared, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech." The right to freedom of speech grants us the freedom to create and erect statues because it allows us to freely express our opinions without fear of punishment. Moreover, while our freedom of speech allows us to express our feelings without being reprimanded, this right does not give us the physical power to take down statues that others have erected through their exercise of their rights. Therefore, the destruction of Confederate monuments is not protected under the freedom of speech. Research done by the Huffington Post and other media platforms suggests that most Americans are not in favor of taking down Confederate monuments. The question asked by the online media source was, do you think statues honoring leaders of the Confederacy should remain as a historical symbol or be removed because they are offensive to some people? Interestingly enough, 62% voted that Confederate memorials should remain, 27% voted to remove Confederate memorials, and only 11% voted not sure. From this data, it is clear that the majority outweighs the minority in this case. Throughout my research, I have seen that this is a very emotionally charged issue. There is no doubt I want to respect the other side's viewpoints. Therefore, I want to bring to the table a compromise that would hopefully work for this issue. A good solution to this debate is to relocate Confederate statues. One idea could be to build a Civil War museum in each state that would house the state's Confederate monuments. Accordingly, the museum would be located in each state's capital, which would allow viewers to see the statue in a proper historical context on government property. Each statue would have a plaque describing the significance of who the statue represents, where it was from, and what role the person played in the Civil War. In each museum, a universal plaque would be placed to show the problems that resided in the Confederacy. Another solution could be one large memorial in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, housing all Confederate statues from each state. Inside the memorial, a hall would be dedicated to each state and their statues. This would keep Confederate statues standing in a proper historical context by representing each state that fought in the Civil War. If these ideas were able to be made a reality, the permanent removal of statues from local areas would give people the option to view the memorial in a proper setting. Since many states have laws in place that prohibit the movement of statues, if both options which have been stated are not allowed in certain states, a final compromise could be to add plaques to the statues that state the entire history of the person in the statue, both good and bad. Instead of destroying these statues, this would also satisfy those who wish to keep the statues standing. In summary, moving Confederate statues to a Civil War museum would be a suitable compromise to the debate about Confederate statues. Overall, these statues of Confederate leaders should remain standing on public land because they honor a significant figure who fought for what they believed in and are an important reminder of something we should never forget because it encompasses historical contributions and supports our rights as Americans. They serve as a reminder of something that should never be repeated in American history, along with celebrating remarkable individuals for their contributions, despite their flaws. Our freedom of speech protects and gives us the right to celebrate the life and contributions of a person to his country through the form of a statue or monument. In a like manner, we should recognize that everyone is imperfect and fallen. Despite this, we should still commemorate their achievements throughout their lifetime. As the United States Representative Henry Waxman once proclaimed, the sanctity of our battlefields, monuments, and veteran institutions is of utmost importance to preserve military history and pay respect to those who fought. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. As you noted in your presentation, this is a very controversial topic. And as we found out in our own interview at Starbucks, people have opinions and aren't afraid to come up to us and tell them. So one of my questions for you then is how did you balance your sources and how did you navigate finding sources for as you research this topic? There are many newspaper articles of people giving opinions one way or the other, so what types of sources did you use in coming up with your solution?
I tried to find online media sources that gave more neutral opinions and stated more factual information instead of one-sided opinions, because many of the articles were very one-sided and they stated information that they viewed was correct instead of the factual information that happened during the rally or whatever happened during that time.
I just want to thank you for this presentation. Well done.